"What rank were you, Grandpa?" The young Marine's voice carried across the crowded GP tent with just enough mockery to make nearby conversations die off one by one. The massive olive-drab canvas overhead rippled softly beneath the afternoon wind, muting the distant sounds of helicopter rotors and families wandering through the Marine Corps Heritage Day event outside. Folding tables lined the center aisle beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Retired uniforms hung beside old battlefield radios and faded photographs from wars most of the younger Marines only knew from documentaries. Near the back corner of the tent, seated alone beside a battered kerosene heater that hadn't been used in years, Harold Whitaker slowly lifted his eyes toward the corporal standing over him. At 89 years old, Harold looked fragile enough to disappear into the canvas shadows around him. His gray flannel jacket hung loose against his narrow shoulders. Deep lines cut across his weathered face like old riverbeds worn into stone. One hand rested calmly atop a wooden cane polished smooth by decades of use. The other held a paper cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. But there was something unsettling about the stillness in him. Something that didn't belong in a noisy military tent filled with restless young men trying too hard to impress one another. Corporal Ethan Cole noticed it immediately, and it irritated him more than he cared to admit. 22 years old, broad-shouldered, and fresh from advanced infantry training, Ethan carried himself with the sharp confidence of a Marine who had never yet been forced to question himself. His desert camis looked pressed straight out of supply. His boots were spotless despite the gravel outside. Around him stood 3 other Marines near his age, all watching with growing amusement as Ethan crossed his arms and tilted his head toward the old man. "You can't sit here, sir," Ethan said louder this time. "This area is reserved for active duty personnel and family members." Harold blinked once. Calmly, slowly, like a man waking from a memory instead of responding to an insult. "I was told to wait here," he said. His voice was low and rough, worn down by age and years of silence. Ethan smirked immediately. Told by who? Harold simply looked past him toward the far side of the tent, where a young Marine Lance Corporal was kneeling beside another Marine struggling to breathe. The younger man's hands shook violently. Sweat rolled down the sides of his face despite the cool October air drifting beneath the tent flaps. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled with static before going silent again. Ethan followed Harold's gaze briefly before scoffing under his breath. "You deaf too, Grandpa?" One of the Marines behind him laughed quietly. Harold didn't answer. Outside, the distant thump of rotor blades drifted low across the base. The sound seemed to freeze Harold for half a second. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Ethan caught it. The old man's fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. Just once. Then relaxed again. Ethan stepped closer now, towering over him. "Look," he said, lowering his voice into something sharper. "This tent isn't some retirement home field trip. So unless you're somebody important, you need to move." Harold finally looked directly into his eyes. Pale blue. Clear. Unmoving. The kind of eyes that had watched too many winters come and go without asking permission from anybody. Ethan suddenly felt something he couldn't explain. Not fear exactly. Just discomfort. Like standing too close to deep water without realizing how far down it went. Then the Marine near the center aisle suddenly dropped to one knee, gasping hard as panic spread through the tent. Chairs scraped violently across concrete. A woman shouted for a corpsman. Ethan turned immediately toward the commotion, but before he could move, Harold spoke quietly behind him. "Get him away from the crowd." Ethan glanced back irritably. Harold continued staring toward the struggling Marine with eerie calm. "Don't let everybody surround him. He needs space to breathe." Ethan frowned. "We got corpsmen handling it." Harold's voice remained perfectly steady. "Then tell them to loosen his collar before he passes out." The confidence in the old man's tone hit differently this time. Not loud. Not dramatic. Certain. One of the nearby Marines hesitated before jogging toward the struggling Lance Corporal anyway. Ethan stared back at Harold Whitaker as the old man slowly lifted his cold coffee again, his expression unreadable beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights and the distant hum of helicopter rotors somewhere beyond the canvas walls. The GP tent had gone strangely quiet except for the low, nervous breathing coming from the young Marine near the center aisle. The Lance Corporal sat against one of the metal support poles now, his hands trembling hard as a Navy corpsman crouched beside him, loosening the collar of his utility blouse exactly the way the old man had instructed only moments earlier. Around them, civilians and active-duty Marines watched with uncertain expressions, their conversations reduced to uneasy whispers beneath the constant buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Corporal Ethan Cole remained where he stood beside Harold Whitaker, but something inside him had shifted. Only slightly, just enough to irritate him even more. He hated the feeling of uncertainty creeping into the edges of his confidence. Harold sat quietly again, both hands resting atop the curved wooden cane between his knees as though none of the tension around him had anything to do with him at all. His coffee cup remained untouched now. Steam no longer rose from it. Ethan glanced toward the corpsman across the tent. The younger Marine's breathing had already started slowing down, the panic in his face fading little by little. One of the Marines near Ethan muttered under his breath, "Lucky guess." Harold heard him. Ethan could tell by the faint movement in the old man's eyes. But Harold said nothing. That silence was beginning to wear on Ethan more than any argument would have. Most older veterans he had met at public events spent their time talking. Long stories, exaggerated memories, constant reminders about how things used to be done. But this man barely spoke at all, and somehow that made him harder to dismiss. Ethan shifted his weight and folded his arms tighter across his chest. "You some kind of medic back in the day?" he asked. Harold looked toward the far canvas wall where sunlight pushed through the seams in faded golden lines. "Something like that," he answered quietly. Ethan exhaled through his nose. The answer annoyed him instantly. Everything about the old man felt incomplete, controlled, like every word had been measured before it left his mouth. Nearby, one of the Marine staff sergeants thanked the corpsman while helping the shaken lance corporal to his feet. A few civilians clapped softly, relieved the situation had not become worse. Harold never once looked toward them for credit. Ethan noticed that too. Outside the tent, a pair of CH-53 helicopters thundered low across the base. The deep rotor wash vibrated faintly through the aluminum tent supports. This time Harold's reaction was impossible to miss. His eyes narrowed slightly. His shoulders stiffened for the briefest moment. Then he tilted his head as if listening to something far away buried underneath the sound. Ethan frowned. "You okay?" Harold blinked once before answering. "That is an old rhythm." Ethan stared at him blankly. "What does that even mean?" Harold finally looked back toward him. "Pilots used to come in low like that during snowstorms. Easier to hear them before you saw them." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Snowstorms. The old man had said it so casually, like he had not just described something from another lifetime. One of the younger Marines nearby chuckled awkwardly. "This guy talks like a movie character." A few others laughed with him. Ethan smirked again, grateful for the shift back into familiar territory. "All right," he said, taking a step closer toward Harold. "Let us clear this up then." He pointed toward the old man's chest where no ribbons, medals, or insignia could be found anywhere on the worn flannel jacket. "You got no unit patch, no veteran cap, no military tags, nothing." Harold remained still. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "So what exactly were you?" The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere outside, boots crunched across gravel near the entrance flap. Harold Whitaker slowly rubbed one thumb across the polished wood of his cane before finally answering in the same low gravel-worn voice. "I was a Marine." The simplicity of the answer drew quiet snickers from nearby tables. Ethan gave a short laugh of his own. "Yeah," he said, "and I asked what rank." Harold's pale blue eyes met his again. Calm, unmoving, heavy as winter sky. "High enough," he said softly. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, the entire tent suddenly felt colder. The laughter inside the GP tent faded faster than it should have. Not because Harold Whitaker had raised his voice. He had not. Not because he had threatened anyone. He had not done that either. It was the way he said the words. High enough. Calm. Flat. Final. Like a door quietly shutting somewhere deep underground. Corporal Ethan Cole forced out another chuckle anyway, mostly for the benefit of the Marines standing nearby. "High enough," he repeated with a grin. "What does that even mean?" One of the younger Marines leaned against a folding table covered with old field radios and laughed louder this time. Maybe he was commanding the bingo hall. More snickering spread through the tent. Civilians nearby shifted awkwardly, pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. Harold remained motionless beneath the pale fluorescent glare. His pale blue eyes drifted slowly across the tent, not avoiding the mockery, simply existing above it somehow. Ethan hated that look. It felt like the old man had already seen this moment happen before. Many times. Ethan stepped closer again, boots scraping against the concrete floor beneath the temporary canvas structure. "You know what I think?" he asked. "I think you are full of stories like every other old-timer that comes through these events." Harold's expression never changed. Outside, wind brushed softly against the tent walls, making the heavy canvas ripple with low hollow flaps. Somewhere across the base, a loudspeaker crackled with announcements about the afternoon demonstration schedule. Families moved between static displays of armored vehicles beneath the bright Virginia sky. But inside the GP tent, the atmosphere had tightened into something smaller and sharper. Ethan pointed toward Harold's cane. "What was it then? Korea? Vietnam?" Harold slowly rubbed his thumb along the polished wood. "Handle again." "Cold place," he answered quietly. Ethan smirked. "That narrows it down." Another Marine laughed under his breath. Harold looked toward the tent entrance where sunlight spilled through the open flap in dusty golden beams. Tiny particles drifted through the air like snow caught inside frozen light. For a moment his eyes unfocused slightly. Distant. Somewhere else entirely. "You ever hear artillery travel across ice?" he asked softly. Ethan frowned. "What?" Harold's voice remained low and steady. "Sound carries different in the cold. Sometimes you heard it before the sky lit up. Sometimes after." The Marines exchanged uncertain glances now. The joking had started losing rhythm. Harold was not telling stories the way they expected. There was no swagger in him. No performance. Just memory. Ethan crossed his arms tighter. "Still did not answer my question." Harold looked back at him. "No," he said. "I suppose I did not." One of the Marines reached for a bottled water from a nearby cooler and muttered quietly, "This guy is weird." Then Ethan noticed something wrapped around Harold's left wrist beneath the frayed cuff of his jacket. A faded strip of dark green paracord. Old. Sun-bleached. Worn nearly smooth with age. Ethan pointed toward it immediately. "What is that?" Harold glanced down once, but did not answer. Ethan crouched slightly, squinting toward the cord. "You wear that every day?" Harold remained silent. Ethan grinned again, sensing the attention of everyone nearby returning fully to him. "Come on, Grandpa. What is the secret?" "Good luck charm." Without waiting for permission, Ethan reached down and lightly hooked one finger beneath the old paracord loop. The instant he touched it, Harold's hand closed around Ethan's wrist with shocking speed. Not aggressive. Not violent. Just immediate. Precise. Ethan froze. So did every Marine nearby. Harold's grip was old, but iron steady. His pale blue eyes locked onto Ethan's with sudden weight that felt colder than the October air drifting beneath the tent walls. For the first time since the conversation began, real emotion moved behind the old man's face. Not anger. Something deeper. Older. Like hearing a ghost speak your name from very far away. The fluorescent hum above them suddenly seemed painfully loud. Ethan swallowed once before forcing out a nervous laugh. "Relax, sir," he said quietly. Harold released his wrist at once. Slowly. Deliberately. Ethan stepped back half a pace without realizing he had moved. Harold lowered his eyes toward the faded paracord around his wrist, his thumb brushing lightly across the fibers. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded distant. "That was tied there during a snowstorm," he said softly. "January 1951. And somewhere deep inside the old Marine's eyes, the warm Virginia afternoon vanished beneath falling snow. For several long seconds, nobody inside the GP tent spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a faint electrical hum, while the October wind pushed softly against the canvas walls. Corporal Ethan Cole stared at Harold Whitaker with a strange tightness building in his chest that he could not explain. The old man's hand had released him almost immediately, yet Ethan could still feel the steady pressure around his wrist like a phantom imprint left behind. It had not felt weak. That bothered him most. Harold sat quietly once again, eyes lowered toward the faded green paracord loop resting against his weathered skin. His thumb moved slowly across the worn fibers, as though tracing something only he could still see. Somewhere outside, children laughed near the armored vehicle displays. A loudspeaker announced the beginning of a rifle demonstration on the western range. But Harold Whitaker no longer seemed fully inside the tent. Ethan shifted awkwardly before forcing a grin back onto his face. January 1951, he repeated. What were you, 10? A couple Marines chuckled automatically, though the laughter sounded thinner now. Harold gave the faintest shake of his head. 19. Ethan scoffed softly. Right. Harold's eyes remained fixed on the old paracord. Cold enough to freeze diesel fuel solid, he said quietly. Cold enough that rifles stopped cycling if you breathed wrong near them. His voice carried no drama, no performance, just memory. The Marines around Ethan slowly stopped smiling altogether. Harold continued staring downward as though the tent floor had disappeared beneath him. Snow reached your knees by sunrise, he murmured. Wind cut through canvas like knives. The fluorescent lights above seemed to dim in Ethan's vision for half a heartbeat. Suddenly, the old Marine was no longer sitting beneath warm electric glow and polished exhibit tables. In Ethan's mind, against his own will, he could almost see it. Endless white hills beneath a black winter sky. Frozen radio wires stretched across snowdrifts. Young Marines huddled inside shallow defensive lines, while distant rotor blades echoed somewhere through the mountains. Harold's fingers tightened slightly around the paracord. We tied those strips around our wrists so we could identify bodies after storms. Silence swallowed the tent. One of the younger Marines, near the folding radios, shifted uncomfortably. Another looked away completely. Ethan felt the back of his neck tighten. Harold finally blinked once, and the distant look in his eyes faded slightly. He glanced toward the entrance flap where cold daylight spilled across the concrete floor. Most of the names are gone now, he said softly. But I still remember the voices. The words landed heavily inside the sudden stillness. Ethan opened his mouth to throw another joke back at him. But for the first time since this started, nothing came out immediately. Before he could speak again, a new voice entered from the far side of the tent. What is going on over here? The tone was low, calm, and dangerous in a way only senior enlisted Marines ever mastered. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Reyes stepped between two display tables carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, with streaks of gray beginning to cut through his dark hair. Reyes carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had spent most of his adult life around Marines in combat zones. His sharp eyes moved from Ethan to Harold, and then toward the Marines standing nearby. Nobody answered immediately. Reyes noticed that too. Corporal Cole, he said evenly. I asked you a question. Ethan straightened slightly. Just handling a situation, Gunny. Reyes glanced toward Harold Whitaker. Something subtle shifted in his expression. The old man sat perfectly still beneath the fluorescent lights, cane resting upright between his hands, pale blue eyes calm beneath deep lines carved by age and weather. Reyes had seen that posture before. Not on civilians. Not on retirees trying to impress people with war stories. On men who had spent years controlling fear because others depended on them to do it. Reyes stepped closer slowly. Sir, he said respectfully. Everything all right over here? Harold looked up at him. For the first time since entering the tent, a faint expression touched the corners of the old Marine's face. Not quite a smile. More recognition than emotion. Still breathing, Harold answered quietly. Reyes nodded once. Then his eyes drifted downward toward the faded green paracord around Harold's wrist. The color drained slightly from his face. Corporal Ethan Cole noticed the change in Gunnery Sergeant Reyes immediately. It lasted less than a second. A tiny tightening around the older Marine's eyes. A slight pause in his breathing. But it was there. Reyes stared at the faded green paracord wrapped around Harold Whitaker's wrist as though he had seen something impossible sitting quietly beneath the fluorescent lights of the GP tent. The wind pushed softly against the canvas overhead. Somewhere outside, children climbed across the static display of an old amphibious assault vehicle while a distant loudspeaker crackled through another announcement. Inside the tent, however, the atmosphere had narrowed into something tense and strangely fragile. Reyes slowly lowered the clipboard beneath his arm. Sir, he said carefully, where did you get that cord? Harold glanced down toward his wrist. His thumb brushed once across the faded fibers before he answered. Mountain Pass north of Hagaruri. Ethan frowned immediately. The name meant nothing to him. But Reyes reacted like someone had just pulled ice water down his spine. He looked back toward Harold's face more closely now. Not at the wrinkles. Not at the age. At the eyes. The posture. The stillness. Ethan noticed it too. Reyes was assessing him now the way Marines assess threats before deciding whether they are dangerous. Who tied it on you? Reyes asked quietly. Harold's expression remained calm. Radio operator named Mitchell. A faint breath escaped Reyes through his nose. Mitchell, he repeated softly. Harold nodded once. Lost 3 fingers to frostbite 2 weeks later. One of the younger Marines shifted awkwardly nearby. Nobody laughed anymore. Ethan crossed his arms tighter, frustrated by the sudden change in tone around a conversation that had started as entertainment. Gunny, he said carefully. You know this guy or something? Reyes ignored him completely. His eyes stayed locked on Harold Whitaker. What unit were you attached to? Harold looked toward the tent entrance again where cold sunlight spilled across the floor in pale gold strips. 7th Marines. Reyes swallowed once. Ethan noticed that too. The gunnery sergeant reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Excuse me for 1 second, sir, he said quietly. Harold gave the faintest nod. Reyes stepped several feet away toward a table displaying old battlefield communication equipment. Ethan followed immediately, lowering his voice. Gunny, seriously, what is this? Reyes kept his eyes on Harold while unlocking his phone. Nothing yet. Ethan scoffed softly. Come on. He is just an old guy telling war stories. Reyes finally looked at him directly. The stare stopped Ethan cold. You ever hear of Chosen Reservoir, Corporal? Ethan hesitated. Yeah, history class stuff. Reyes nodded slowly. A lot of Marines froze to death up there. His voice dropped lower. The ones who survived did not usually talk much afterward. Ethan glanced back toward Harold. The old Marine sat exactly where he had been the entire time, hands resting atop the cane, expression calm beneath the pale lights humming overhead. He looked harmless, ancient, ordinary. But now Ethan felt something else beneath the surface. Something heavy. Reyes turned his attention back to the phone screen. His fingers moved quickly through a military archive database requiring command credentials to access retired personnel files. Ethan leaned slightly closer. You are actually checking him? Reyes did not answer immediately. Then quietly he said, that cord is not random. Ethan frowned. It is just paracord. Reyes shook his head once. No, his eyes narrowed at the screen. Not olive green braided with black stitching. Ethan stared blankly. Reyes continued typing. Some units tied those during the Korean War so recovery teams could identify bodies after blizzards. The words landed like stones in Ethan's chest. He looked back toward Harold Whitaker again. The old Marine remained motionless while families and active duty personnel moved through the tent around him, completely unaware of the invisible gravity gathering quietly at the center of the room. Reyes suddenly stopped typing. His face hardened. Ethan noticed the change immediately. What? Reyes stared at the screen without blinking. That cannot be right. Ethan stepped closer. What? Reyes slowly turned the phone away before Ethan could read it. But not before he caught a glimpse of one line near the top of the personnel archive. Retired Sergeant Major Harold E. Whitaker. Status: restricted command access only. Beneath it sat another line highlighted in dark red letters. Call sign: Frost 6. The fluorescent lights above the GP tent suddenly felt harsher to Corporal Ethan Cole, their pale white glare reflecting off folding tables and polished concrete like cold winter sunlight on ice. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Reyes kept staring at the phone in his hand as though the words on the screen had physically struck him. Around them, the Heritage Day event continued in distant fragments. Children laughing outside. Helicopter rotors pulsing low across the base. The metallic clatter of equipment cases being unloaded somewhere beyond the tent walls. But inside the immediate circle surrounding Harold Whitaker, everything felt strangely muted. Ethan stepped closer toward Reyes. Gunny, he said quietly, what does Frost 6 mean? Reyes locked the phone screen immediately. His jaw tightened once before he slipped the device back into his pocket. Nothing you need to worry about right now. Ethan frowned. You look like you saw a ghost. Reyes glanced toward Harold sitting alone beneath the fluorescent lights. Maybe I did. Ethan followed his gaze again. The old Marine had not moved. His weathered hands remained folded atop the curved wooden cane. The faded green paracord rested quietly around his wrist, like an ordinary piece of fabric carrying the weight of another century. A family walked past nearby holding souvenir Marine Corps flags and never looked twice at him. Ethan could not understand how that was possible anymore. Reyes stepped closer to Harold now, his boots slow against the concrete floor. When he spoke again, the edge in his voice was gone completely. "Sergeant Major Whitaker," he said carefully. Harold lifted his eyes. "Been a long time since somebody used that rank." Reyes nodded once. "Sir, were you with Baker Company during the breakout?" Ethan noticed it immediately, the way Reyes asked the question. Not casually, carefully, like a man approaching something sacred. Harold remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered softly, "What is left of them?" Reyes lowered his eyes briefly. The reaction confused Ethan even more. He had seen senior enlisted Marines yell at officers without blinking. Yet now Gunnery Sergeant Reyes looked almost nervous standing beside this quiet old man in a worn flannel jacket. One of the younger Marines nearby whispered under his breath, "Who the hell is this guy?" Ethan did not answer because he wanted the same question answered himself. Reyes looked back toward Harold again. "Sir," he said quietly, "most records about Frost 6 are sealed." Harold gave the faintest shrug. "Most records should stay buried." Reyes studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "The Corps still teaches that radio defense at Quantico." Ethan blinked. "Wait, what?" Reyes finally looked toward the younger Marines standing around them. "There was a communications position during the Korean War," he said slowly. "Temperatures dropped nearly 40 below zero. Entire units got cut off in the mountains." His eyes drifted briefly toward Harold again. One Marine held the radio line open long enough to guide evacuation convoys through the pass. Silence settled heavily across the tent. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. That was him. Reyes did not answer immediately. Harold did instead. A lot of men were there. His voice stayed low and rough with age. Most never came home. No pride. No performance. Just fact. Outside the tent, a helicopter thundered overhead low enough to vibrate the canvas supports. Harold's eyes lifted slightly toward the sound. Ethan noticed the movement instantly now. The old man listened to rotor blades the way other people listen to voices. Reyes slowly pulled his phone back out again. This time his movements were more deliberate. Ethan saw him scroll quickly through contacts before stopping at a secure command number. "Gunny," Ethan asked carefully. Reyes kept his eyes on the screen. "Corporal," he said quietly, "do not say another disrespectful word to this man." Ethan swallowed once. "I did not know." Reyes finally looked directly at him. "Exactly." Then he stepped several feet away toward the rear corner of the tent, where old field radios sat beneath framed battlefield photographs. Ethan watched as Reyes placed the phone to his ear. The gunnery sergeant stood perfectly straight while the call connected. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Sir," he said, "this is Gunnery Sergeant Reyes at Heritage Tent Charlie." A pause followed. Reyes glanced toward Harold Whitaker, sitting quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. "I believe Frost 6 is here." The change on the other end of the line was immediate. Even from 20 feet away, Ethan saw Reyes straighten harder instinctively. His expression shifted from concern to complete disbelief. Then came the words that made the blood drain slowly from Ethan Cole's face. "Do not let him leave," the voice on the phone ordered. The words echoed in Corporal Ethan Cole's head long after Gunnery Sergeant Reyes lowered the phone from his ear. "Do not let him leave. Not please. Not request. An order. Sharp. Immediate. The kind of tone reserved for emergencies or visiting generals." Reyes stood motionless for a moment beside the old communications display, the glow from his phone screen reflecting faintly across his face. Then he slipped the device back into his pocket and exhaled slowly through his nose. Ethan watched him carefully now. Everything about the gunnery sergeant had changed. His posture, his voice, even the way he looked toward Harold Whitaker carried a weight Ethan had never seen before. Around the GP tent, normal activity had resumed in cautious fragments. Families wandered between displays again. Marines resumed quiet conversations. Somewhere near the entrance flap, a retired colonel laughed loudly while describing old deployment stories to a group of civilians. But inside the small, invisible circle surrounding Harold Whitaker, tension still hung heavy in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Harold himself remained perfectly calm. He sat with both hands resting atop the polished wooden cane, eyes drifting occasionally toward the canvas roof whenever helicopters passed overhead. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him. Ethan could not stop staring at the old man now. Not because he looked impressive. He did not. His flannel jacket was worn thin at the elbows. His boots were old brown leather scuffed by years of use. Nothing about him matched the image Ethan had always associated with military legends. No medals. No unit cap. No stories volunteered loud enough for strangers to hear. Just silence. And somehow that silence had forced an entire command chain into motion. Reyes walked back toward them slowly. "Sir," he said carefully to Harold, "there is somebody coming who will want to speak with you." Harold nodded faintly as though he already knew. Ethan frowned. "Who?" Reyes glanced briefly toward him. "Lieutenant General Marcus Hale." Ethan blinked. "The base commander?" Reyes gave a single nod. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "You called a 3-star general because of him?" Reyes lowered his voice. "No, Corporal." His eyes drifted back toward Harold Whitaker. "The general was already notified before I finished explaining." Those words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Nearby Marines had started noticing the strange tension too. A staff sergeant near the entrance kept glancing toward Reyes. 2 younger lance corporals whispered quietly beside the battlefield radio display. One of them looked directly at Harold before quickly looking away again. Rumors moved fast on military bases, faster than wildfire through dry grass. Harold slowly adjusted the cuff of his flannel jacket. The faded green paracord disappeared partially beneath the fabric again. "You did not need to call anybody," he said quietly. Reyes shook his head immediately. "Respectfully, sir, yes I did." Harold looked toward him for several seconds. There was no arrogance in the old Marine's face. No expectation of ceremony. If anything, he looked tired. Not physically. Deep tired. The kind carried by men who had spent too many years remembering things nobody else could understand. Outside the tent, the sound of approaching vehicles rolled faintly across the pavement. Doors shutting. Boots moving quickly over gravel. Ethan noticed Reyes hear it too. The gunnery sergeant straightened instinctively. Several Marines near the entrance turned toward the sound. Then came the sudden crackle of radios. Short clipped voices. Security personnel moving fast. The atmosphere inside the GP tent shifted instantly. Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. People stood straighter. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One Marine, near the center aisle, quietly tucked his shirt tighter beneath his utility belt. Through the open entrance flap, Ethan caught sight of black government SUVs pulling alongside the curb outside the heritage tents. A pair of military police officers stepped out first, scanning the area automatically. Behind them emerged a tall figure in service uniform with silver hair beneath a green cover. Lieutenant General Marcus Hale. The entire tent seemed to inhale at once. Ethan felt his stomach tighten immediately. 3-star generals did not walk into temporary exhibit tents during public events unless something serious had happened. But what unsettled him most was not the general's arrival itself. It was the fact that Harold Whitaker never even turned around to look. The sound of boots approaching across concrete echoed softly through the GP tent as Lieutenant General Marcus Hale stepped inside beneath the rippling olive-drab canvas. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Marines, near the entrance, straightened on reflex. Civilians moved quietly aside without fully understanding why the atmosphere had changed so suddenly. General Hale walked with the steady, controlled pace of a man long accustomed to command. His service uniform was immaculate beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, rows of ribbons catching pale reflections as he crossed the center aisle. 2 military police officers followed several steps behind him before stopping near the entrance flap. But the general never looked at the displays, never acknowledged the startled Marines snapping nervously to attention around him. His eyes remained fixed on one person only. Harold Whitaker still sat calmly in the same folding chair near the back corner of the tent. He had not turned when the vehicles arrived, had not reacted when security entered. He simply rested both weathered hands atop the curved wooden cane while the low hum of helicopter rotors drifted across the base outside. Corporal Ethan Cole stood frozen several feet away, his pulse suddenly pounding hard enough to feel in his throat. He watched the 3-star general move directly toward the old man with an expression Ethan had never seen on a senior officer before. It was not anger. It was not ceremony either. It looked closer to reverence. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes immediately snapped to attention beside the communications display. "Sir," he began quietly. General Hale raised one hand slightly, without taking his eyes off Harold. Reyes fell silent instantly. The general stopped less than 3 feet in front of the old Marine. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Wind brushed softly against the canvas walls. Somewhere outside, children laughed near the static helicopter displays, completely unaware of the silence now gripping every Marine inside the tent. Ethan noticed Harold finally lift his eyes upward slowly. The two men looked at each other for a moment that felt strangely private despite the dozens of people surrounding them. General Hale's jaw tightened once. Then, without hesitation, the commanding general of the entire installation came sharply to attention. The movement snapped through the tent like a rifle crack. Every Marine nearby instinctively stiffened. Ethan felt his stomach drop. General Hale raised his right hand in a perfect salute. "Sergeant Major Whitaker," he said quietly, "it is an honor to finally meet you." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ethan stared in complete disbelief at the sight in front of him. A 3-star general standing at full attention before the quiet old man he had mocked less than an hour earlier. Harold looked up at the salute with tired, pale blue eyes. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he returned it. His hand trembled slightly with age, but remained perfectly precise. General Hale lowered his salute first. His voice softened. "Sir, we thought you were gone." Harold's expression barely changed. Almost was. A faint, uneasy murmur spread through several Marines near the back of the tent. Ethan heard somebody whisper the words Frost 6 beneath their breath. General Hale glanced briefly around the room now, his sharp eyes passing over the stunned faces of active-duty Marines and civilians alike before settling momentarily on Ethan Cole. The young corporal felt heat flood instantly into his face. Hale did not raise his voice. Somehow that made it worse. "Do you Marines understand who is sitting in front of you?" Silence answered him. The general looked back toward Harold again. "During the winter breakout at Chosen Reservoir," he said steadily, "communications collapsed across nearly every position in the sector. The tent had become so quiet that even the buzzing fluorescent lights sounded loud now." Hale continued. "One radio line stayed open." Ethan felt cold settle slowly into his chest. The general's voice lowered further. "A 19-year-old Marine held that line through an entire night so convoy routes could be redirected out of the mountains before the pass closed." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Harold Whitaker lowered his eyes quietly toward the faded green paracord still wrapped around his wrist. General Hale's expression, hardened with emotion, held carefully under control. More than 200 Marines made it home because Frost 6 never left the radio. And for the first time all afternoon, Corporal Ethan Cole finally understood why the entire command structure had frozen the moment Harold Whitaker's name appeared on a screen. The silence inside the GP tent lingered long after Lieutenant General Marcus Hale finished speaking. Nobody shifted. Nobody whispered. Even the civilians standing near the old battlefield displays seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something far larger than a normal military ceremony. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while cold October wind pressed against the heavy canvas walls. Harold Whitaker remained seated in the folding chair near the back corner of the tent, his weathered hands resting atop the polished wooden cane, his pale blue eyes lowered quietly toward the faded green paracord wrapped around his wrist. He looked uncomfortable beneath the attention now focused entirely on him. Not proud, not triumphant, just tired. General Hale slowly lowered his voice. The Corps spent decades trying to verify how that radio position stayed active as long as it did. His eyes remained fixed on Harold. Every account said the same thing. Ethan Cole stood frozen several feet away, barely breathing. Hale continued softly. The line never went silent. The words settled heavily through the tent. Ethan suddenly remembered Harold's calm voice earlier in the afternoon. Get him away from the crowd. Loosen his collar. The certainty in it. The control. The stillness beneath pressure. None of it had been an act. Harold finally looked up toward the general. A lot of men carried that line, he said quietly. General Hale nodded once. And every surviving report named the same Marine staying behind the radio. Harold's eyes drifted briefly toward the tent entrance where sunlight spilled across the concrete floor in pale gold streaks. Somebody had to answer when they called. The simplicity of the statement struck Ethan harder than any speech could have. No dramatic story. No attempt to sound heroic. Just responsibility. Quiet and absolute. One of the younger lance corporals, near the battlefield radio display, slowly straightened to attention without being ordered. Then another Marine beside him did the same. Within seconds, the movement spread naturally through the tent until every active duty Marine stood rigid beneath the fluorescent lights. Ethan remained motionless for half a heartbeat before snapping upright himself, heat flooding his face as shame settled heavily into his stomach. He remembered every joke, every smirk, every dismissive word thrown at the old man sitting quietly only a few feet away. Harold noticed the movement around him and looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "You boys do not need to do all that," he murmured softly. General Hale looked down at him with deep respect visible beneath the command presence in his face. "Yes, sir," he answered quietly. "We do." Harold let out a faint breath through his nose that almost sounded like reluctant amusement. Outside the tent, helicopter rotors rolled low across the base again, the deep rhythmic sound vibrating faintly through the metal support poles. Harold's eyes lifted instinctively toward the noise. Ethan saw it clearly now. Not fear. Memory. The old Marine listened to rotor blades the way some men listened to old songs. General Hale glanced toward Ethan then. The young corporal immediately felt his chest tighten. "Corporal Cole." Ethan swallowed hard. "Sir." The general's tone remained calm. "You asked Sergeant Major Whitaker his rank earlier today." Ethan felt every pair of eyes inside the tent shift toward him at once. "Yes, sir." Hale nodded once. "Did you get your answer?" Ethan looked toward Harold Whitaker. The old Marine met his eyes calmly with no anger in them at all. Somehow that made the shame feel even worse. Ethan straightened harder. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Harold studied him for a moment before speaking in the same low gravel-worn voice that had carried through the tent all afternoon. "Rank matters less than the men beside you, son." Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Harold looked back down toward the faded cord around his wrist. "Always remember that." Outside, the October wind rolled across the base carrying distant rotor noise and the sound of young Marines laughing somewhere beyond the heritage tents. Life continued forward the way it always did. But inside, the GP tent, beneath the pale fluorescent glow and rippling canvas shadows, every Marine standing there understood something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Some men never stop carrying the weight of their service, even long after the uniform is gone.